Welcome to CNI 421, a course taught by the Mid-Level Education Program at Illinois State University. Today's topic is the future of middle schools. We're going to look at some trends that are impacting middle schools today and how they might affect the future of middle schools themselves. Before we get into the trends and examining them, I always like to share a story that came out of a national middle school conference in about 12, 15 years ago. Every year at the National Middle School Conference, there's a William Alexander Memorial Lecture that is presented by a distinguished teacher educator. And one year, the distinguished educator was Dr. Paul George, who's retired from the University of Florida, but a very noted middle school specialist. Dr. George told the story about Benjamin Franklin and the Constitutional Convention that occurred after the Articles of Confederation weren't going to work for the new nation. Delegates gathered in Philadelphia at Faneuil Hall, and they argued and bickered about what kind of government we ought to have and how it should be shaped and what it should be look like and so forth. Franklin was pretty old by that time, and he used to go and sit for a while and quite often would nod off and so forth, and he'd get tired of the proceedings in the afternoon and wander home and take a nap and those sorts of things. Well, while the delegates were arguing, it was in the summer, it was pretty hot, and they'd leave the windows open, and the townspeople that could afford to would stop by and listen outside the windows to the great statesmen as they debated. And there was a woman that used to come and listen all the time, and as they were getting close to the conclusion of the convention, she was standing outside the door, and the vote had occurred, and Franklin was leaving. He got tired and was going to go take his afternoon nap, and the lady said to him, "So what will it be, Mr. Franklin? What kind of government will we have?" And he said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." And what he meant by that is that this new nation was so revolutionary, so unusual, so different than what people around the world knew at that time, that he was afraid that it was so fragile that it might end up getting subverted or overthrown or whatever. I mean, there was quite a bit of sentiment still in the new United States to have the new government be a monarchy like they had in England and France and other places, but chose to write the Constitution and have the republic that we have now. Well, Paul George said that these were perilous times for middle schools as well, and this was the late 1990s. And he said, "We have middle schools if we can keep them." And by that, he felt like that there were some extra threats to the middle school that we'll look at in our talk today and see if we can't do what Dr. George said, keep middle schools around. There are 8 trends that seem to be impacting middle-level education and that will continue to impact middle-level education and possibly have a bearing on its future. Those 8 trends are perceptions of young adolescents. That's adult perception of young adolescents. Perceptions of middle schools themselves. What do people think about middle schools? Federal intervention into education, and in particular middle school education. Variations of implementation of the middle school philosophy and organization. The teacher shortage in middle-level education. We're not talking about the number of bodies. We're talking about people who are really qualified to teach young adolescents. The 6th trend is homeschooling and the increase in the number of children being homeschooled. The 7th trend is technological innovations that are impacting all schools, but in particular middle schools. And the 8th trend is the widening gulf between have and have-not schools, including middle schools. So the first trend that we mentioned of the 8 trends is adult perceptions of young adolescents. What do adults think of these youngsters that are age 10 to 15 years old? Well, frankly, in the last 30 years, there has been a considerable amount of research that has been conducted on young adolescents. And actually, most of the research has been helpful because they've painted a picture of young adolescents as quite capable, quite competent, not nearly as wild and crazy as they're typically portrayed. And the research is helping us understand young adolescents better. We've presented a lot of that research in this course in the earlier modules, so you should be pretty familiar with that research. Despite the research, though, there is still quite a bit of myth and inaccuracies prevalent in society when it comes to adolescents. Many people believe that middle school students are out of control, they're loud, they're rude, they're self-centered, they're oversexed, impossible to control, those sorts of things. And if you've ever been a middle school teacher, as I have, when someone you meet that's new says, "Hey, what do you do for a living?" You say, "I'm a teacher." And they say, "Well, what do you teach? Like high school or something?" And no, I teach at a middle school. They usually take a step back and give you a very worried expression. But there's really no need for that, as we know. But unfortunately, that's part of the myths. And so one of the things that we have to do is continue to share the research that we find that suggests that young adolescents are quite typical for their age, quite typical as students, and quite capable as students as well, both in behaving properly and learning academic content. And then finally, one of the things that has impacted adult perceptions of young adolescents too is modern media. There's a considerable push in the last, again, 30 years to portray young adolescents in TV and movies and books and so forth. And some of the media influence is positive. Things like The Wonder Years and Malcolm in the Middle do a pretty good job of portraying young adolescents as, normal people, capable people, that sort of thing. But then there is also some media influences that aren't so good. And you'll see that as well out there. Ones that portray young adolescents like the myths. And so it's something that we have to continue to consider when we're teaching young adolescents is, are they these real people or are they the myth themselves? The second trend impacting middle level education now and possibly into the future is the perceptions of middle schools themselves. What does the public think about this entity called a middle school? And actually, there's quite a wide variance about what the public thinks. But many people in public sector, and especially politicians, which can be problematic, obviously, feel that the middle school spends more time on personal development of children rather than academic subject matter content. And so they have this sort of simplified view of schools that they're either academically rigorous or they're not. And middle schools often are considered to be not academically rigorous. One of the ways that middle schools in the future, now and in the future, can battle this perception is through the National Middle School Association standards. There are standards for middle schools, and middle schools are, teacher educators are expected to meet those standards, and middle schools themselves are held to certain standards across states in the nation. One of the programs state organizations support around the nation is the Horizon School Schools to Watch program. It's called other things in other states, but in Illinois it's the Horizon School program. Basically, this is a program that's run by the Association of Illinois Middle Schools here in Illinois, where middle schools that think that they have an exemplary program can apply to be recognized as a Horizon School to Watch. And they do that by conducting a self-study of their school. They submit a report. which is then considered by a panel of experts, which would include teachers, administrators, and professors in middle level education. Then the panel examines the report and decides whether it's worthwhile to visit the school to verify what is in the report. And if in fact a visit is scheduled and the team that visits the school is able to verify that this is an exemplary middle school, then they are added to the list. And then they become a school that quite often other school personnel come to visit to get a good sense of what a middle school is like. So there are those schools out there, and we have to make the public aware that there are excellent middle schools here in Illinois. They've been designated so, and children are learning quite a bit there. The academic versus personal development argument sort of spills over into the something I already mentioned, soft versus rigorous, and quite often again the media, politicians like to pick on middle schools as being soft, and quite frankly, good middle schools are not soft. They have a very challenging curriculum, but it's appropriate for the developmental level of the students in the school. Of course, one of the things impacting the perceptions of all schools is high-stakes standardized test scores. And we'll talk about federal intervention next in our next slide, but obviously that has had an impact on all schools, including middle schools, and it's an area of concern because young adolescents are not the greatest test takers in the world for a variety of reasons, some of which you've already learned about in this semester. And finally, what's in a name? We'll look at another slide coming up about the variations in implementation of middle school. And that's problematic because there are quite a few schools in the country that call themselves middle school but adhere to very little of the appropriate middle school organization and philosophies. There are some schools, especially in this state of Illinois, that are called junior high that are fantastic middle schools in terms of their organization and philosophy, but they didn't change the name of their school for a variety of reasons. Typically, to try to tamp down those poor perceptions of middle schools in some communities. So that's another problem with the perceptions of middle school, is that a middle school is not often a middle school. And so it's unfair to pick on the middle school movement because a school is not very good that calls itself a middle school that doesn't have middle school philosophy or organization in it.